Hey guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm talking to Dr. Martin Refalo. He recently finished his PhD and has been working on lots of exciting studies. One very close to our heart as bodybuilders is that on protein. He looked at the relationship between fat-free mass retention and protein, and various protein intakes and how much protein led to the best fat-free mass retention, i.e. we're losing lots of body fat and maintaining our hard-earned muscle, or even gaining muscle tissue. And this was a really good analysis that was very exploratory in nature. And he talks about how important it is to understand that it's an exploratory relationship and why maybe some of the finding within the research isn't aligning exactly with the practical recommendations from the lead authors here. And there's lots of great discussion here where you might look at this paper and decide, hey, more protein is better. And maybe it is, or maybe there's more thought to go around that, talking about the evidence at large, being a practitioner, an evidence-based practitioner. And Martin does a great job of describing what that truly looks like. So guys, I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. And as always, if you do enjoy it, or even if you don't, give us a thumbs up, give us a comment, give us a like, give us a review over on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you're able to review the podcast. It would be highly appreciated. Share it with anyone you think might enjoy it. And if you're not subscribed already, please do just hit that subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. As you guys are aware, we always dig into the latest and greatest in natural bodybuilding and how to maximize your and your clients' results. So definitely do all of that. I'd highly appreciate it. Yeah, if you're still listening to me now, pause, please go ahead and do that. But without further ado, let's get into the chat with Martin. Martin, welcome back. Thank you for taking the time to be on the show. It's been a while. I actually like to look back to see when someone's last been on, but so many of my guests now, like yourself, have been on so many times that it just starts to become like, oh, yeah. What's the point? You're just a friend of the show now in many ways. And actually, I think the last episode was probably when you're on talking about what does a research lab actually look like. And you did a fantastic job with us for that. But since then, and you've been doing a lot of work and on various studies and kind of bits and pieces like this, which we're definitely going to talk about. But I always like to just get an update for the audience and for me on how you as a trainee, coach, educator are doing. Anything of noteworthy going on your end. I know you recently just spent some time with Brad Schoenfeld, the kind of GOAT of hypertrophy research. So I'd love to hear a little bit. Give us an update.
Thanks, Steve. It's always a pleasure to be here. I think it must be my sixth time, if you include that recent video we did about what research actually looks like in the lab. But the last time we formally spoke, I had probably just finished my PhD, but not formally graduated yet. I think I just finished my failure study, and so since then I have graduated. I'm officially qualified as a PhD in exercise science, which is pretty cool. And I have backed off a little bit on the research front, I guess. Over the past few months, you might have seen my name on a few papers recently, but the truth is, those papers, they've been in the works for 6 to 12 plus months. So it really is a long process, a long time-consuming process, and it was cool to have quite a few papers published in the earlier stages of this year. But for the most part, I have been backing off a little bit on the research front, focusing on my coaching, my full-time work, on my training, and of course a little bit of travel as well. So yeah, recently spent a bit of time in Singapore with Brad, which was really cool. One of the things I love most about traveling and presenting is not just being able to share my knowledge with so many other coaches who are then going to go on and share that knowledge with their clients and so on, but getting the chance to just train with people like Brad and spend time with people like Brad to discuss ideas and have a laugh on the gym floor. It's really cool to be able to do that with other individuals in the industry who are held at a pretty high regard. So that's where I'm at the moment, and can't wait to chat about some of the research that I've had the privilege of partaking in recently.
Really, really cool. I must have missed that you got your PhD, and now I can call you Dr.
You
Refalo.
can,
Refalo.
yeah.
I pronounced your last name wrongly. And
Refalo.
actually, Refalo, saying failure study sounds bad. I just was,
Yeah,
as you were talking me through it, it's like if people don't know the context behind
okay,
your
yeah,
research, they hear failure
yeah,
study and they're like, oh, what
yeah,
went
yeah,
wrong?
yeah.
It's like,
That's a
oh no,
problem. Yeah,
nothing went wrong.
proximity to failure study.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, that's exciting, and it makes sense. I think from people I've spoken to who are like in a similar position to yourself, they've got their PhD, they tend to kind of take a bit of time to like back off a little bit and refocus their efforts on other things, which makes complete sense. I think I actually saw on your Instagram you recently took like a competitor stage and things, so that's
Mm,
exciting. Is that the, do you have like a, I guess when you're kind of channeling everything into the PhD, obviously you were doing your coaching
mm,
on the side, everything you do
mm-hmm,
with JPS, do you have like
mm-hmm.
a, now a focus? I guess the PhD was like the main focus. Now, do you have like somewhere you're looking to go to build towards?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess for the past 3 years, my attention and energy has been quite split across my coaching, my online coaching, some teaching, the research. Of course, a lot of it has been biased towards the research, but it's been refreshing to be able to shift that energy to other avenues that I'm also so passionate about. So spending more time on the gym floor, um, working with my competitors, etc. There was a point I think back in 2022 where I think I had 4 or 5 competitors competing in the one season whilst I just started my PhD, and that was really hard. Like it was hard for me to manage that. And looking back at it, it would have probably been wise to kind of have a cap on the amount of competitors I was actually putting through a comp prep. As you could imagine, one is a handful. One can sometimes be a handful on their own. Uh, but yeah, at the moment, putting all my energy towards my full time work at JPS, doing some teaching at Deacon as well, which is cool because I upskill a lot of coaches through JPS when we travel, etc. Coaches who are on the gym floor, doing their thing. But then at Deakin, at the university, I get to upskill kind of a different batch of individuals who are interested in fitness, like people who maybe don't have any coaching experience just yet because they're quite young. We're speaking about kids who are 18, 19, 20 years old, who just started their exercise science degree, but they're passionate about exercise science, they're passionate about fitness, and they're really trying to determine where they want to take their future. And it's cool for me to be able to play a role in kind of molding that and guiding them forward. Because in Australia, when you go through a bachelor's in exercise science, there are quite a few pathways that you can take, but it's very competitive. Just in Deakin alone, there's about 700 or 800 students, going through exercise science this year, let alone all the other universities as well. So it can be quite competitive. It's quite saturated, and it's important that students do have a specific pathway that they're working towards. And yeah, I'm able to play a role in that whilst I teach them exercise programming or human physiology or whatever it might be. So yeah, that's where most of my attention is at the moment. And it's also cool to be able to from a research standpoint, just do some collaborations in the background. So I'm not really leading anything at the moment when it comes to research, which is obviously very hard to do when you're the lead author, doing most of the work. I've been asked to do some collaboration, so just kind of working in the background and still helping push some of the research along as well. So it's basically at this point I've kind of shifted my energy, my attention less towards research, more towards coaching, teaching, etc. And it has been refreshing to do that because a PhD really does pigeonhole you into a certain kind of avenue for 3 years at a minimum. That for me was okay. Research, designing studies, conducting studies, statistical analysis, proximity to failure for like 3 years, and it's tough. It's tough. So it's a bit of variability has been very much welcomed.
That's awesome. I think it's so good that you had JPS and your coaching and everything there in the background? Because I know some people, maybe I've spoken to some people in this field where they've left their PhD and then they want to go into the coaching space, but they haven't got that already got it in the background going, and it's not built to the level you've got it, where it's like, I imagine it's something where it's like, actually I have the demand there almost, and so it can just kind of fill this hole, which is so great. And it's good to see you be able to do that and kind of just reprioritize things and continue to grow. And it's great seeing you like not only coming onto this podcast and different platforms, but then going and educating elsewhere. It just speaks to your character and what got you in love with kind of learning and educating and everything you're doing. So that's really cool. And it almost sounds like as well, when you get your PhD, it's like you get when you become a manager in your career. It's like you don't have to do so much. I don't know if I'm wrong saying this. So much of the like grunt work, you can let other people now who are working towards their PhDs kind of do that, and you can oversee things a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, yes. Like I've had a few, I shouldn't say a few, but two different kind of research groups almost now replicate my proximity to failure study, not my failure study, my failure versus RIR study. So they're basically using a very similar study design and like rerunning it with different exercises and muscle groups. You know, some details are obviously going to differ, but a very similar study design. So I'm not doing a brunt of that work. Obviously, I've already kind of done my part by, doing the study in the first place and being so transparent with the methods, etc. And so now I get to kind of still help with, putting things together. But it doesn't take as much out of me, which is good.
Yeah. And that study, by the way, was fantastic. If people haven't listened to that episode, I can't refer to the specific number, but they should definitely check it out, because that was the word that comes to mind was bulletproof, and it was a very good study design, because it doesn't surprise me people are replicating that one, and that's good for the field at large.
Exactly.
So to talk about some of your more recent research, people might have already been aware. I had Eric Helms on and we touched on it briefly, talking about some of the commentary behind your research that looked at basically protein intakes during calorie deficits and what seemed to be the protein intakes that led to the best fat-free mass retention or even growth. And kind of Eric was, I guess, responding to some of the comments that Menno had, and some people may have, if they've seen and been privy to this, they might have seen some of the back and forth you guys had. But it'll be great for you to kind of, first of all, explain why your results were exploratory, which I think is important, and not confirmatory, and what that means. Or if, I don't know if you want to start with a different question or kind of lay the foundations for talking about it.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to bring up. So, as most listeners probably know, the idea here was to assess the relationship between protein intake and fat-free mass retention in an energy deficit, right? Focusing on resistance trained individuals. So there were kind of multiple layers to this research question. It was a very niche research question, but that's what we were trying to get at. Now, when we, put out the results and the findings, we made it clear that this was an exploratory analysis, okay? And people might be thinking, well, what does that mean? And basically, when we do an exploratory analysis, we are trying to find a signal in the noise, right? And it's where we generate ideas and look for patterns that would otherwise go unnoticed, right? So maybe it's not the most robust analysis, but if we weren't to do that analysis, then we wouldn't be able to recognize the potential patterns in the first place. Confirmatory research, on the other hand, is where we formally test, specific ideas under stricter conditions. And of course, the results are therefore more robust. So our paper offered insights, not rules. And, those insights, they need to be tested further under stricter conditions if we are to, derive really concrete, definitive recommendations from them. Now, some people might ask, and, I've been asked this, they might ask, well, what's the point then of having exploratory research if it doesn't give us a definitive answer? And the thing we need to understand is that science is simply not designed to give us answers, right? It doesn't give us certainty. In fact, it gives us uncertainty, and oftentimes we are trying to estimate that uncertainty in our statistics. So, these exploratory analyses, they're important because they also help us identify research gaps. And if you as a listener know what gaps we have in the research and what we can be really confident about and what we can't be as confident about, then you're less likely to fall prey to misinformation when you come across content online as well. So there's many benefits to exploratory analyses that often are kind of dismissed or not really understood. Now, you might also ask, well, why did we choose to do an exploratory versus a confirmatory analysis, right? And the reason is we didn't necessarily have a choice, because really it kind of depends on the data set you're working with. So like I said before, we were trying to estimate this relationship between protein intake and fat-free mass change, right? So basically what we're trying to say is, well, is it more beneficial to eat higher versus lower protein intakes when you're trying to retain fat-free mass? And so ideally, we'd have studies that were designed to answer this question, where they compared a low protein group with a high protein group and then assessed the fat-free mass outcomes. Now, interestingly, there weren't actually many studies that directly compared low versus high protein conditions. There were only a handful, and this is why we couldn't conduct a traditional meta-analysis, which is, in fact, more confirmatory, right, in most cases. So most of our data involved studies that had multiple conditions eating the same protein intake. And the thing is, these studies, they weren't necessarily concerned about fat-free mass outcomes that much. So for example, one study might have three similar protein conditions, right? Or let's say 2 times body weight in protein, but each of the conditions may then differ in like the calorie deficit size. So the study might be looking at, body fat loss or something like that, as opposed to fat-free mass retention. But we were still able to grasp that data and use it. Okay, so for example, we weren't comparing in our analysis, we weren't comparing low protein condition versus high protein condition in study 1, right? We were just comparing a protein condition in study 1 versus a protein condition in study 2 versus study 3, 4, 5, etc. And as you could imagine, if we're comparing from study to study, well, all of a sudden, right, we have studies that employ different methods, right? So if I compare a protein group in this study 1 versus study 2, well, what if the training protocols look a little bit different, right? Maybe the frequency or the volume of training is a little different. Or maybe one of the studies didn't even prescribe a resistance training program. They just told their participants to continue training habitually, right? All of a sudden, we have these between study variables that can impact the overall relationship we're trying to estimate. And what we call these variables are covariates. So, they're known as covariates, and we can add covariates into our statistical model to estimate how they impact the relationship between protein and fat-free mass change. And you'll often hear people say, well, what about this? Did you control for that? This is a confounder. And, the reality is these things exist between studies, no doubt, and we can do our best to account for their influence within the models, but only to a certain extent, right? We can't add too many covariates, or else there will be too much noise. All right, so I said before, we're trying to find a signal in the noise. Is there even a signal there? And if we have way too much noise because we're trying to account for literally everything, right, it just breaks the model down, and all of a sudden we can't really run a robust enough analysis. So, that's where we were at with the data set we were working with, right? And that's why we said, we were explicit about the fact that, our whole approach was exploratory in nature, designed to find the signal in the noise, to generate new ideas and hypotheses for future testing. But there's still some insights there that we can, derive and, put towards a practical recommendation. It's just the way in which you would go about doing that is obviously really important, and is what will make or break, how you kind of use the data, how you interpret the data, and how useful it actually is in practice.
That was so well explained, Martin. And I think just that point of that science isn't to give you black and white answers ever. It's almost to lead to more questions often versus anything else. And it's kind of pushing you, or no, pushing is maybe the wrong word, but it's indicating the answer, and it's taking you further to the truth. It's not giving you the actual truth in every situation. And then it makes complete sense why you set up the study the way you did, in terms of being exploratory, almost creating like this big study based off all these little studies. But also those co-founders make complete sense. And I guess one of them that people would think of is like training or untrained. Like if people weren't doing resistance training, this is a huge confounder. But I believe that's one of the things that you made sure, like every study was, they were doing a resistance training protocol. Am I correct? I think you said that before.
Yeah, so each of the studies involved resistance training. That was part of the inclusion criteria. The only issue was the training characteristics themselves were generally poorly reported. So because some of these studies, like I said earlier, weren't really set up to assess fat-free mass change, they just happened to record it and report it in the paper, so we were able to use it. They clearly just didn't care about training that much. They some studies would briefly overview the training program and the sets and the frequency. That was great. We'd be able to kind of extract that. But then a lot of studies didn't explicitly state exactly how the participants trained. And in some cases, off the top of my head, I believe, I don't even want to give a number, it was more than 10 studies though that basically instructed participants to just continue on with their habitual training, right? So again, all participants trained, they had some level of training experience, but the thing is, we couldn't use any training characteristics as covariates within the model because we just didn't have that data available, right? So we couldn't add, for example, volume into the statistical model to see whether the impact of protein intake on fat-free mass change was conditional on the volume being completed, right? So I guess that is a limitation of our study. We weren't able to account for differences in training protocols between studies, but it's also simply a limitation of those studies themselves. So again, this is why the exploratory component of our analysis is so important, right? We are acknowledging, right, that these between study differences, right, that we couldn't account for completely, they are playing a role, right? Training's got to impact your ability to retain fat-free mass, and we weren't able to model that into our statistics.
Yeah, it's just one of many variables that might impact kind of the results there, but probably the most important one. And so it's just a good example for the listeners to understand, this is why it's exploratory. We can't take the kind of results, as it were, from this and be like, that's how I'm going to set up my protein intake for all my clients now, because this is the way. And actually, on reading the paper, that wouldn't be what people would take from it anyway, because that wasn't kind of your recommendations there. No. But it would be great, I guess, for the listeners to know what were the results and what were your more practical take homes and advice for coaches and trainees.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess whenever you are reading an article, especially a pretty comprehensive article like a meta-analysis or meta-regression, whatever it might be, it's important to understand that there's a difference between describing the findings and providing practical recommendations, right? So when I run through the findings of our analysis, what I'm doing is I'm describing the dose-response relationship, right? So I'm telling you what is based on the findings, not what ought to be for you in practice, right? And there is a big difference between the two. And, from my conversations with, coaches and people who are, immersed in kind of exercise science and the evidence-based community, sometimes you'll hear people kind of expect, it'll almost be as if they expect that the finding is the practical recommendation, right? The description of the finding is a practical recommendation, but that is not the case. We have to tease the two apart. So we have the description, and then, after a few steps that might involve some critical thinking, right, we can get to a practical recommendation, right? So when it comes to the description of the findings in this case, like I said before, we wanted to know how protein predicts fat-free mass change and whether that relationship was conditional on some of the covariates that we could include in the model, right? So the covariates that we ended up including in our model were participant sex, so male or female. We estimated calorie deficit size, and we were able to include that. A body fat percentage that was easy to extract from the study, so we included that. And intervention duration as well. So those were the 4 variables that differed between studies that we could extract with confidence and add it into the model to estimate whether they played a large role in influencing the relationship or not. All right, so like I said before, okay, describing the dose-response relationship. So how much does fat-free mass change per 1 gram increase in protein intake? That's what the dose-response relationship is going to tell us. But the way in which that trend line will kind of extend across that dose-response graph, which a lot of listeners might kind of be familiar with some of the recent meta-regressions on volume, right, and proximity to failure, and your previous work on protein intake, you're going to see this trend line kind of extend across the graph. And sometimes it looks completely straight. Sometimes it can have a curve, right? So we have this possible linear relationship. So a straight line relationship between the predictor, which is protein intake, and the outcome, right? So the value of the predictor increases. As the value of the predictor increases, so does the outcome linearly, right? It's a straight line relationship. But we can also have a non-linear relationship where that line can bend, and it can bend once or it can bend twice, regardless of how many times it bends, it's going to curve at some point. And so the effect of the predictor in this case changes across different values. Right, so maybe as the predictor, so which is protein intake, as it increases, right, that trend line might start to change shape a little bit. Okay, and in this case, you might imagine a trend line that showcases some level of diminishing returns. Okay, we call that a non-linear relationship. And so, in our analysis, we decided to trial both types of models, right, to see which one fit the data best, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to estimate what this relationship could look like in a few different ways, right? These ways have slightly different assumptions about how the line might look. And then basically we compare the models to assess under which model the data is most probable, right? How well the model generalizes new data. So if new data was to be added to the model, how well would it kind of generalize to that? Would it be able to stand its ground against new data, or would it change shape completely? And which model can do all of this with the least complexity, right? And the complexity portion of this is important, and it actually has implications for practical application. So what complexity means is, okay, how many times can the line bend, that regression line, right? The more times you allow that line to bend, the more complex the model becomes, right? And it's harder to interpret, and it's harder to then take those interpretations and apply them in practice. And also, what can make a model more complex is the number of covariates you add to the model. And I mentioned this earlier. We could try and account for 100 different variables or covariates that will differ between studies, but the more we add in, right, the more complex the model becomes. And this is, where, some commentary that you might come across online, really does stand on some shaky ground, because people will say, well, why didn't you control for this? Like I said before, right? Why didn't you add this into the model, etc.? It's like there's only so many things we can kind of add to the model, so many things we can do before we really start to compromise its integrity. And, we want a model that can explain the relationship very well with the least amount of complexity, right? Because if I have less complexity that I need to explain to people in the paper or across a podcast, for me, that's a positive thing, right? Especially if it's explaining the relationship to an extent that I deem is sufficient. And for the listener, right, for the individual who is trying to apply these findings in practice, right, that is also a positive thing, right? That's something we should be striving towards, right? More complexity doesn't always necessarily mean, a better result or a better analysis. So after doing all this, we found that the linear model turned out to be what we call the best fit, right? So the data was the most probable. It predicted the data really well, and it was the most parsimonious model. Okay, parsimonious in this case just means explains the data really well with the least amount of complexity, and we chose that model, right, to derive our interpretations from. Now, this doesn't mean that it isn't possible for the relationship to be nonlinear, right? That is completely possible. If we were to add more data in, the way that trend line would look across the graph might change. That's possible, and we showcased all the additional models that we did in the paper and the supplementary file, so people can check them out if they like. We just decided to go ahead with the linear model as our primary form of interpretation because it was the best fit, and it was the best fit for both protein expressed per kilogram of body mass and protein expressed per kilogram of fat-free mass. Okay, and we analyzed both, which is really important. So basically, for both protein prescriptions, there was a linear relationship, right, associated with fat-free mass change. So eating more protein did lead to more favorable fat-free mass change. And what this means is that participants either lost less fat-free mass or gained more fat-free mass as they consumed more protein. Okay, so the probability of this relationship being positive was very high, was very high, and it was a little more precise, I can say, for protein expressed per kilogram of fat-free mass. Okay, and you might be thinking of some possible reasons as to why that may be the case. Okay, so there was less uncertainty with that protein prescription. Now, what we also have to understand is that this dose-response relationship, it has its bounds, right? And its bounds are dependent on the studies that were included in the analysis and the protein intake ranges that they assessed. So, for example, when we're looking at protein per kilogram of body mass, right, the protein intakes assessed in the studies went all the way up to 3.2 grams. Okay, so the dose-response relationship that I'm describing here ends at 3.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass, and then for protein per kilogram of fat-free mass, we had 4.2 grams. Okay, so those are the bounds that we're operating in here, right? So it's not an endless linear relationship, or at least not not based on the data that we have available. Now, although the probability of a positive effect was very high, okay, what we need to understand is that the size of the effect itself was considered small based on traditional effect size standards, and that's really important, right? So we have the probability of the effect being positive, right? So how confident are we that this line does move in the direction we can see it move in on the graph, right? But then what's the size of the effect going from 1 gram of protein to 2? What's the size? How steep is that line, right? And that's the magnitude of the effect. How steep is that line, right? And we found that going from 1 to 2 to 3 grams of protein, yes, it continued to provide more favorable fat-free mass change, but it was considered a small effect size, right? And that's something that, as a practitioner, it's up to you to consider how important you think that is. And finally, what I'll say when it comes to describing this dose-response relationship is that we were also able to estimate some of the variance, right? So basically, protein and some of the other aspects of the model, they only explained about half of the variation in the data, right? So when you think about that, if they explained about 50% protein and some of the other aspects of the model only explained 50% of the variation in the data, you might ask, well, where's the other 50% coming from? And I guess it's coming from all the covariates, all the variables that we weren't able to really model, because we chose the least complex model, which didn't actually include any of the covariates, because it happened to explain the data just as well as the models that did have the covariates, right? So we have now 50% of this variance being unexplained, and you might ask, well, what could be leading to that variance? Well, we spoke about it earlier, Steve, right? It's the training characteristics between studies, right? Slightly different sample demographics, right? The environment across all these individuals, across all these studies, is going to be a little bit different. There's a whole host of other things out there that could impact the between study comparisons that we had. And one of those main ones is probably training, because we know how potent training obviously is for fat-free mass retention, and that clearly leaves a door open for future research to come in and say, hey, let's run a robust study where we're actually looking at fat-free mass change in individuals who are in a deficit. We're going to compare low versus high protein groups, and we're going to control training to the best degree possible. Obviously, a little bit easier said than done, but it can be done. And hopefully, with some of these research gaps now being exposed, lab groups worldwide can eventually catch on if they're interested in protein and work towards building stronger conclusions.
Really enjoyed your answer there in terms of, first of all, just kind of explains to the listeners why the findings might differ from the recommendations within research. I think that just broadly across like loads of different studies could be a good message to have. One that immediately comes to mind was the Enos. I think it was the 52 sets they got up to with their quad volume, and so many people were looking at that and being like, oh, so you're saying we should do 52 sets? It's like, no, that's not what we're saying. That was what we found. But we could definitely recommend something quite different if you talk to Enos or some of the people on that paper, or people educators within the space. And so the same here, where you have that obviously linear relationship. And I, again, really appreciate you explaining why you went with that model versus others in terms of like the simplicity. You're trying to find the right balance there where you can explain what's going on without making it overly complex. And again, it just makes so much sense. And it's actually, in many ways, when you were describing it in terms of almost the diminishing returns past a certain point, or like very diminishing returns or greater diminishing returns, the relationship sounds a bit similar to what we're seeing with volume in many ways. And again, people can look at some of the research coming about volume and that dose response relationship and be like, oh, so you're saying we should do like more is better always, so on and so forth. It's like, no, there's many other things you have to take into consideration, the person's goals, so on and so forth, that you have to kind of put into the mix. And also great to have that understanding that the protein is only explaining 50% of the relationship there. We have these other variables that are worth considering. And I'd love to hear from you, Martin, in regards to like protein being one piece of the puzzle. What are some mistakes people might make on interpreting this research, maybe taking it too far, where they're like, oh, so clearly more protein is better? What are some kind of things you'd advise people to avoid or consider when they're now looking at this and maybe updating their protein intakes?
Yeah, and I guess some of the things that I'll discuss go for any interpretation of a dose response relationship or general study finding. We alluded to this idea of practical evaluation in the paper. So in the practical recommendation section, we spoke about how you need to practically evaluate these findings. Now, what does practical evaluation mean? Well, firstly, to practically evaluate research effectively, I think you need like a solid foundation of experience, right? So, to be a good evidence-based coach, I do tend to see experience as the foundation, right? Because experience can actually help you interpret research in a more effective and, ecological way. And Steve, I'm sure you've probably noticed that in yourself, maybe some people that you speak to, where you notice that people who do have a solid foundation of experience can think critically about research, right? And make strong, useful, practical recommendations. Now, the problem is, experience isn't created equally. So does experience just mean the number of years you have in the field? Does it mean the number of clients you've worked with? I think it means a little bit more than that. Like, experience requires deliberate and intentional learning over time, right? So making sure you receive feedback from your clients and you try and act on that feedback, have discussion with peers, these types of discussions with peers and other individuals in the field that you respect, not being stuck in your own way for 5 to 10 years, which, a lot of people are, right? So experience does need to mean a little bit more than just years in the field or how many people you've worked with. But once you have experience, it's like you kind of have, the way I see it is you kind of have half of the puzzle already put together, right? Because we know there's many coaches out there who rely heavily on their experience-based evidence, right? And get good results. I mean, it's definitely possible. And that's probably because they have half the puzzle put together. Now, the good thing is if you have solid foundation of experience and you want to use research and you want to derive ideas from the scientific research, scientific evidence, well, you have half the puzzle already done. You can kind of see what the picture looks like, right? You kind of know what the other piece of the puzzle need to look like and where they need to go. And it makes it a lot easier for you to read results of research and be like, okay, I get what this is saying, right? It's describing the findings, but I need to think a little critically about how I'm going to use this in practice. And, this is where practical evaluation actually comes into play. So, where people go wrong when they're looking at a dose response relationship and trying to take something from it is they either don't consider trade-offs, right? So they look at that trend line, they see it going up, and they automatically interpret that the top end of that trend line is where we need to be. Okay, like I said before, describing that relationship does not equal a practical recommendation. And in this case, some people will just dismiss the trade-offs of, a really high protein intake, for example, or doing really high volumes, right? Or pushing all sets to failure, right? There are trade-offs, right? In the proximity to failure meta-regression, right? There were studies that only did one exercise. So clearly, if you do more than one exercise in practice, there's a trade-off to interpreting that dose-response relationship as it is described. The return on investment. Okay, so like I said before, we can be pretty confident that a positive relationship is evident, but what is the return on investment from going from taking your protein intake to 2 grams, right, per kilogram body weight from 1 gram? What is that return on investment, right? What is that effect size looking like? We need to consider that. We also should consider how close or far the dose response relationship is from what we're already doing. Now, what I mean by this, Steve, is that if you've been, prescribing your clients, just over 2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight in their deficit periods, right? Let's say it's 2.3 or whatever it is, 2.2, which is, similar to what Helms recommended back in 2013. Let's say you were doing that and you were getting pretty good results and you were confident and happy in the results you were getting, and then you see the results of this meta-regression come out. What you're doing really isn't too far from what the relationship looks like. It's pretty close. So you then have to consider, well, is it even worth me changing what I'm doing, right? You don't actually need to change what you're doing if what you're doing is already pretty close to what some of the data is suggesting. Right now, on the other hand, if you happen to be prescribing, let's say 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram body weight to your clients going through a fat loss phase and trying to retain as much muscle as possible, and you see this data come out, well, clearly there's a bit of a discrepancy there, and you should consider making an adjustment to your strategies, right? Because there is a possibility that you could be doing better. Right, and you don't know for sure, right? You can't really know for sure that you were absolutely maximizing results with that intake you were previously, prescribing, right? So the proximity of what you're currently doing with what the data is suggesting, that's something you need to consider. And you don't always have to make changes to your strategy if it, closely maps what the data is suggesting. Same goes for volume. If you find that you're prescribed, certain volume ranges that, fit closely with kind of what we're seeing, some of the recent research is saying, well, maybe it's suggesting that there might be, diminishing returns after, let's say, 10 sets, in a session for a muscle group. And if you're hanging around that, 7, 6, 7, 8, 9 mark, right, maybe you're doing pretty well. And you don't necessarily need to change what you're doing if it's providing if it's promoting some good results with your clients, right? And you're able to observe that, you're able to measure that, you're happy with that, you're confident in what you're doing. So you do have to consider that too. And then the last thing that you need to consider is, well, what potential factors might actually moderate that relationship in the real world? Right, and unfortunately, how I describe the dose-response relationship just can't, my description just can't involve acknowledgement of every single variable that could potentially impact the relationship. And that's why I said earlier that experience is such a big part of all of this, because if you are experienced and you've had experiences with clients, right? Putting them through fat loss phases and adjusting your methods now and then to see what works well, and knowing that what works for one person doesn't work for the other, right? And you've spoken to peers about this, and you've grasped their ideas and you've tried to implement them yourself. That's the experience I'm talking about. If you have that, all of a sudden right, that there's variables out there that are going to impact this relationship and how it might look. Okay, we've already spoken about training quality, right? There's sleep, there's other nutritional factors like carbohydrate intake, right? There's a whole lot going on that you need to be able to piece together when you're interpreting these dose-response relationships and you're trying to convert that description of the relationship to a practical recommendation. So in this case, we're seeing that protein does provide more favorable fat-free mass changes as it increases, right? That's the description of the dose-response relationship. But as a listener, as someone who's trying to implement science in their own training or with their clients, well, what are the trade-offs? What's the return on investment? How close or far is this from what I'm already doing, right? Is the data from what I'm already doing? And what factors might moderate the overall relationship that I can think about that are relevant to me or the clients I'm working with?
Really nicely said. Yeah, I think that you mentioned there, obviously, as we've already said, this was describing kind of a 50% of the relationship, that other 50%, and a big piece of that being training. You mentioned like carbohydrates. It's like suddenly if someone's like, so more protein leads to more kind of fat-free mass retention or growth, and their carbohydrate intake plummets, and now their training performance is just in the like gutter, and that's gonna, as someone like you and me, Martin, and a lot of the listeners will know, like that's not a great way to retain muscle mass. So you definitely take these things to extremes. But when I think about myself, and I love that description of, hey, where are you now, and then you can think about where does this data take you.
Mm-hmm.
It, in some sense, confirmed my bias in that I quite like higher protein intakes. A lot of my
Mm-hmm.
clients do. Another piece
Mm-hmm.
could be adherence. Like you might be like, oh no, you have to have this really high protein intake to retain as much muscle as possible. But if they're not going to adhere to the diet, then suddenly it all falls on its like face, So it's considering that person's goals in mind too. But yeah, for me, it's kind of confirmed that, hey, my kind of preference and the results I've been seeing with slightly above the kind of average recommended protein intake has been confirmed here, which is nice. But yeah, I think a lot of the listeners will appreciate that. For you and your practice, Martin, did it change? Did any of the outcomes surprise you? Did it change anything to your own recommendations for your clients? And if you were to, are there any numbers you would, or ranges you would provide the
Oh.
listeners when you think about volume? Obviously, a lot of people think about that 10 to 20 kind of range to
Mm-hmm.
think about landing within. Is there anything like that you can provide the
Mm-hmm.
listeners?
Yeah, I guess naturally people also ask whether these findings are relevant to individuals outside of a deficit. And then usually I get asked, well, what's the difference going to look like between protein intakes for individuals at maintenance or in a surplus versus in a deficit? And I guess recently we've also seen how some of the data that has been widely adopted and kind of popularized over the years from the Morton et al. Meta-analysis. Some of that data, if you really look into the paper and actually read it and read the statistics, the ranges that they came up with and the kind of the break point analysis that they conducted, where they noticed kind of diminishing returns after a certain point, that actually wasn't statistically significant. And this was a big lesson for me that I experienced over the last few months, because that Morton et al. Paper that's again been widely adopted, and you read about it everywhere. I bought a sports nutrition textbook not long ago, and there was the graph and there was the description of the graph. There was never any mention of it not being statistically significant, right? And I never really looked into it because it was so widely accepted as, this is protein intake, this is how protein intake should look if you're trying to build muscle. And that was the only study that was that's been cited for years when you're reading about protein intake recommendations. And the lesson for me was to continue to question and look into research, even despite widespread adoption, right? Even when it's become so popularized and it's almost become like dogma, it's just accepted as truth and passed on from one person to another. The lesson for me was, hey, if you're seeing these studies, that's a good thing, right? It's generally going to be a good thing because on average, it's not going to be completely wrong if well-respected people are promoting it and speaking about it. It's not going to be completely wrong, but still, a lesson to look into it and to dig a little bit deeper, because, you now hear people speak about the idea that maybe the protein intake recommendations derived from that data should be a little higher for individuals who are at maintenance or in a surplus, right? And one thing I will touch on as well is there was a little bit of pushback against our recent protein paper, because we just used fat-free mass and lean body mass, outcomes, and obviously they really don't map onto true muscle mass changes perfectly, right? We know that and we acknowledge that, but the modern meta-regression also only used fat-free mass and lean body mass changes too. So we kind of need to understand that if we are to derive better interpretations and conclusions about protein intake, right, most of the studies we're dealing with just assess fat-free mass, right, with a DEXA scan, for example, or whatever it might be. And that just has to be another layer of consideration, right, that we put into our overall interpretation of the data. We do have to consider that. Now, when you take all of this into account, for me, I agree, Steve. I'm on board with you. Like, I enjoy a high protein intake. I generally prescribe, for many years, I've usually just prescribed roughly 2 times your body weight in protein, right? If I have a client come through the gym doors who's pretty set on building muscle, changing their physique, they can train a few days a week and they're invested, which, look, most of my clients are, which is great. I'm usually saying 2 times your body weight in protein. And you know what? That's worked pretty well, I think. Now, I can't be sure that it's, I've yielded the maximum result from my clients prescribing that protein intake, but I'm retaining all my clients and they're all building muscle and getting stronger. So yeah, something must be working. Now, now that I look at this modern paper and kind of, reinterpret it, do I need to increase my protein recommendations for these types of individuals? Maybe not. Basically, since I've kind of, read Greg Knuckles' take on things, for example, looked into the paper again myself, 2 grams is now like a bare minimum for me. It's no longer like, anywhere around 2 grams is okay. I'm going to be like, hey, you're coming to see me to maximize muscle growth. Let's aim for 2 grams if you're going to be able to adhere to it. And most people do tend to get there after a bit of time, kind of paying a bit more attention to their protein intake. And when it comes to individuals in a deficit, for a while now, I've also been erring on the higher side of protein intake for these individuals, and I guess that's inspired from Eric's 2013 paper where he kind of hypothesized that leaner individuals, particularly who are going through a deficit, may require more protein. And of course, it's always context dependent. Like I said, depends on whether the client can adhere. But for the most part, if I'm working with a bodybuilder or someone who's attempting to get pretty lean and is in a deficit, then I'm looking at over 2 grams per kilogram of body weight for sure. As a prescription, does that mean that I take it all the way up to 3? With some clients, yes, and others no. So my recent client who's competing, who is now probably like 25 weeks into their diet, getting pretty lean, well under 8% body fat, I would say now, as his glute striations are starting to creep out. He's eating probably pretty close to 3 grams per kilogram of body weight in protein. So it's about 220 grams of protein. 220, 230, so it's on the higher end. And have my findings particularly influenced that? Not necessarily, because it was something that I was kind of already doing. It's just reinforced what I'm doing, and I know that the findings aren't perfect. I know that it's fat-free mass, for example. I know there's other variables that come into play here, but my thought process is that protein must play a positive role, and if I am fine with the trade-offs, if I am happy with the return on investment, even if it's quite small, if I understand what factors are moderating the outcome and they're in place, right? So training's good, sleep is good, stress is good, I don't need to worry about anything else. Then look, I'm happy to go with a pretty high protein intake, and reevaluate on a week to week, month to month basis based on adherence and other things. But for the most part, when working with bodybuilders and people trying to get pretty lean, I've never really had an adherence issue with protein. And like, let's be honest, let's say I cut 40 grams of protein out and added 40 grams of carbohydrate in, for someone who's like 7% body fat, probably not going to make much of a difference.
Yeah, I it's nice, and I'm nodding a lot because it's again very confirmatory of how I've kind of prescribed these things too. And with protein, at least, I'd always been on the side of I never wanted to, unless someone really didn't like eating protein or struggled with it, I never really wanted to side with the minimum, like we know can provide close to good outcomes or maybe even maximum outcomes. I was always like, if protein's so important, I'd prefer to edge on the side of caution. And so long as it's not taking away from anything else, as you mentioned, then why not go for a bit more? It doesn't seem like there's any harm in going a bit higher. So it's kind of, with the research coming out, it's confirmed that element of just like, hey, siding with a bit more there, and again without any kind of detriments towards huge detriments with carbohydrates being pitifully low or fat intake being really low or anything along those lines. I don't see that as a problem. And I think probably you're probably similar to me in this way, Martin. Maybe not, but a lot of the listeners will be, I think, like influenced from just old school bodybuilders who always like espouse these very high protein intakes. And actually working with Cliff Wilson this past year for my 2024 contest season, it was very close to that 3 times body weight in kilos intake. And he's found great results with high protein intakes, particularly in dieting phases. And I think there's a reason, like he's got a hell of a lot of experience. And so that kind of had influenced me too. So yeah, I think it's just a great discussion surrounding kind of, as an evidence-based practitioner, how do you go about interpreting these results? Where does that come from? Your own experience, other people's experience, people you kind of trust, respect, and then data like this, again, just either nudging you in a certain direction, whether or not that's thinking, like you said, if you've been going towards the minimum kind of numbers that had been out there from some of the research, maybe bumping them up slightly, or maybe it helps just confirm that a lot of the things you'd been doing were on the right sort of lines. So it's great to have you kind of dive deep into this discussion. I don't know if there's anything else you kind of wanted to discuss regarding this paper.
Yeah, just a couple things. I guess, people might be listening to this and they'll notice that, they come across other individuals in the industry who might disagree with, really high protein intakes, or really they might just come across people disagreeing in general. And they might be thinking, well, how can these, PhDs, these reputable industry experts disagree with each other? And, what I will say is logical disagreements are completely fine. There is absolutely nothing wrong with people disagreeing about study results, or at least the way in which they are interpreted, right? And their practical recommendation. And in fact, in all areas of science, there are disagreements between experts, right? Even in physics, like people think that physics is like the most robust area of science, and it's robust, but there's still ideas in physics that are debated on an ongoing basis, right? They agree on gravity and, other things they don't agree on. And especially in an applied science like exercise science, Steve, I'm sure you agree, so much of what we do, so much of what you do is like experience-based evidence, right? Most of what you do with your clients, right, is probably coming from your experience. Now, your experience is you speaking to people on a podcast. It's your own training. It's having discussions with Pascal. It's working with different clients, trialing your methods. And of course, you're trying to use the science to refine that. And I'm sure you're doing that well. But a big chunk of it, because the science doesn't tell us everything, it hasn't covered all bases, and it won't ever do that, right? A big chunk of it has to come from this experience that we're describing, like is the case with Cliff Wilson. And we do have to kind of understand that that is okay, right? It's okay for these logical disagreements to be present in exercise and nutrition science, as long as they're logical, which sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And it's okay for practical recommendations to look a little different, as long as they are somewhat in line, right, with the data. Like if you're doing the complete opposite to what the data is suggesting, right, no matter what experience you have, you're probably never going to put that puzzle together. But as long as you're in line with that, like where you sit on that dose response curve, like it kind of depends on your style, your situation with your clients, the clients you work with, what they want. And of course, a lot of your decisions are simply going to stem from all these experiences that we're discussing, right? So yeah, I think it's common for people to sometimes be confused, coming across conflicting opinions online. And, I do resonate with that, because it's sometimes hard to decipher if you don't have the knowledge, and, you don't know what to label as true, what to label as false. And I guess if you're a trainee, this is why, having a coach is like so valuable, because they're going to try and do that all for you. And if you're a coach and you're struggling to decipher and to know what to do with your clients, maybe you need to take a few steps back and go back to the basics. I was speaking to someone about this the other day. I think these days, with the nature of content on social media, obviously short and sharp, headline heavy, it kind of takes us away from what I call desirable difficulties with our learning. So a desirable difficulty with your learning is doing something for the benefit of your learning that is difficult. Like it's literally time consuming and it's hard to do it, but you might get a better payoff. You might retain the information better. You might understand it better. You might be able to connect the dots better. So for example, reading a textbook, right? Or reading the Pyramids by Eric Helms. Like it's literally hard to sit down and read. It's a lot harder than it is to scroll through social media. It's hard to read, highlight, write notes. It's time consuming, but it's what we call a desirable difficulty. If you do that, you're going to retain the information better. It's going to pay off a lot more. You're going to understand it. And, unfortunately, it seems, based on the observations that I've had, the conversations that I've had with coaches, right, social media is driving us away from that, right? That's what I meant earlier when I said, if you're struggling as a coach to interpret all this and you're not sure what to do and who to listen to, maybe you just need to take a step back, right? And if you ever are kind of presented with an opportunity to learn something and you're like, oh, that's going to take me some time, or this course there's too many hours to on too many hours of video to watch on this course, or too many pages to read, that's probably a sign that you should go ahead and do it, right? Go ahead and do the course or read the book. If learning is coming across as difficult, that's a thumbs up. If it's simply just watching a 30-second reel, 1-minute reel, and you find yourself only trying to learn from that, it's not a surprise to me that you're going to end up a little bit confused about what to do with yourself, with your clients, etc.
Really well put together. Yeah, I think it's the kind of textbooks and that kind of more difficult, challenging way of consuming and learning is falling out of favor. I think it will return at some point, because people will just understand that they're not getting what they want from the kind of that short form content. But that's something that I've definitely had discussions with a lot of my clients or coaches too, and they kind of again get a bit almost paralysis by analysis of just seeing all this new information coming out, or they're just getting burnt out from it all. I mean, podcasts I think are pretty good, but even podcasts, there's so many if you want to try and keep up with them all. And again, there can be different opinions. And I'm always just try and remind them and draw them back to those basics, the big principles, which are outlined in textbooks. And so it's a great place to just revert back to, look at, like you said, the muscle and strength pyramids, literally look at the pyramids, just be like, oh, where does this all fit? And a lot of the disagreements come within those, like the top ends of the pyramid, or they're within the ranges that are recommended. And it's like, hey, everyone, and as you said, everyone comes to this from a different point. There could be a coach out there that has seen just great outcomes with lower proteins and higher carbohydrates, and that's just worked for his audience, and they might attract people that seem to get great results that way because they're appealed to that kind of person and the way to discuss things, and it confirms their bias. And so you always come from a kind of that background. You have to always remember your own experiences and biases come into it, and being open-minded to different ways of doing things. There are definitely multiple routes to the same sort of outcome. So it's always good to remember that too. But Martin, I know we had some more papers to discuss. We probably don't have time to discuss those in any sort of depth now, but we'll definitely get you back on to discuss some more of this, because I think you always do such a great job of flushing out the research that you do and really putting it out there so that people can take it the right way, because I do think there's a wrong way to interpret some of this research and take it on. So yeah, I just want to say a massive thank you for doing that. First of all, for doing the research, but also making sure with your social media content for making it very apparent of what you want people to take away from it, and not kind of appealing to just kind of getting the clicks and the likes and being kind of, that sort of way about promoting it. So thank you very much. And if people want to keep up to date with your work, Martin, and where you are, where should people be heading?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, either on my personal Instagram, mrfitness_, or check out the JPS Education pages to keep up to date with, what we're doing from an education perspective. If you ever want to know more about my research or have any questions, feel free to reach out, give me DM. Always happy to help people kind of better understand the work that I put out there, because I know that it's hard for some people to really grasp all of the things and that I put out there, the research, the stats, whatever it might be. So always happy to help if you're interested in chatting.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that's linked below, and I'll also, of course, link the study that we've discussed today. So if people want to dive into all of that, they absolutely can. Yep. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Martin, again, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you.